Hi, thank you, Akiko, for joining me. I'm here with Akiko Iwasaki, who's a professor of immunobiology at Yale, and is just going to be launching a new center for infection and immunity, or for
Mhm.
immunity and infection. I think infection and
I
immunity,
think
right?
infection immunity, yes.
So why don't we just start with that briefly and tell us what the center's about, and then we can go on to sort of long COVID and ME/CFS and so on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, David, for having me here. So we have this new center at Yale called Yale Center for Infection and Immunity. And the center is created to really focus on two things. One is to study the pathobiology of post-acute infection syndromes, which includes long COVID and ME/CFS, as well as other post-infection induced syndromes. And the second arm is to really prevent these types of diseases from occurring by developing effective vaccines that not only prevent disease, but also transmission and infection. So we're very happy to have this center. We have a number of members that are already on board and starting to investigate a variety of aspects of these diseases.
So one of the things you just said was, which is interesting, which you refer to it as post-acute infection, as opposed to the standard terminology, which has been either post-infectious, or post-infection or post-viral, if we're talking just about viruses. So that's because I think so I wanted to explain that distinction.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for noticing that. So we are calling it post-acute infection syndrome because we don't really quite know what the etiology of the disease is, whether it's really caused by chronic infection by the original virus, and or it may be something that the original infection trigger that is kind of cascading into a different type of disease in the absence of the original infection already being cleared from these people. So because we don't really know exactly what the driver of the disease is, we're just calling it post-acute infection syndrome to be able to encompass variety of possibilities.
So in that sense, the term post-viral or post-infection syndrome would be really kind of a misnomer, because it might be excluding the possibility of continuing viral either replication or viral particles or some parts of the virus that are still extant in the body. Okay. So one thing that's interesting is that, of course, in the ME/CFS world, everybody knew or predicted in March, or whenever we first, learned about this, that there would be a wave of people after initial infection would have non-specific symptoms, just like sort of cluster like ME/CFS, who would then be psychologized or be told that you're just anxiety or depression. This was really, really predictable, but it seems that it took sort of the medical world and the policy world by surprise. So that we're having this wave, and with sort of some disbelief and doubt as well. So what do you think that is? I mean, what was going on there?
Yeah, so from perspective of people like yourself who are really aware of these prior literature on ME/CFS and what happened during that time, it is indeed quite predictable what would happen after a pandemic like this. But for a vast majority of population who's never even heard of ME/CFS before, and who's really never lived through a widespread pandemic like this, it was not predictable in their mind.
Mhm.
And it did hit many people by surprise. And I must say that I wasn't really focused on these post-acute phase of the infectious disease myself. And so I had to kind of learn, about what was already studied in ME/CFS and other fields
Mhm.
to catch myself up. But you're right. Because it wasn't a very widely sort of discussed disease to begin with, I think people were quite surprised that this happened and it's still happening.
Mhm. So why don't we sort of scope out a bit what are the current sort of hypotheses for pathogenesis, or that have been sort of scoped out by the various research that's been done.
Yeah. So again, it's really borrowing from the book of ME/CFS, but essentially there are four main ones that we're working on. The one is the persistent virus infection. And this is why I said we don't really know what the driver is, but there is a wealth of literature now demonstrating the presence of viral antigen, RNA, and a combination thereof in so many different tissues. And there's even this nice study from Tim Henrich's group that looks at the PET scan of people after having COVID months before, and they're seeing activated T cells in places that, well, we didn't imagine before, like in the spinal cord and things like that. So there is, I think, enough evidence to suggest that there's a chronic replication of the virus going on. And they may be deep in the tissue, like in the colon, for example. But so that's first hypothesis is the persistent infection. And this also includes a sort of second branch, which is the possibility that there may not be an intact viral genome anymore left, but maybe bits and pieces of defective viral genome that's creating the viral antigens and RNA, but they're not themselves sort of transmissible. So that's also kind of borrowing from other viral infections that these things could happen. In the case of measles, for example. So we were kind of including that in the big umbrella of persistent virus. The second hypothesis is autoimmunity. And we know that many infections can lead to autoimmunity and exacerbation of autoimmune diseases. So it's possible that the acute COVID infection did lead to activation of these self-reactive T cells and B cells. And that could be leading to this very long-term consequences. And the third hypothesis—
That would make it sort of an autoimmune disease of some sort? In that
exactly
that category?
It could lead to one of the known category of autoimmune disease, or this may be something that's not yet defined in the rheumatology field, right? So we're very open-minded about it. We are just looking at over 6,000 different human antigens to see what people are actually reacting to. So that's sort of the second hypothesis. Third one is the reactivation of latent viruses that many of us carry. And we are seeing evidence of that as well. Just like what we've been reported in ME/CFS field, the reactivation of Epstein-Barr virus, for instance, is now reported by 3 or 4 groups in people who develop long COVID.
And other viruses as well seem to be replicated, seem to be reactivated, yeah?
Exactly. So we're seeing evidence for EBV as well as VZV, which is the chickenpox virus, reactivation only in the people with long COVID, but not the people who recover from COVID. So this suggests to me that there's some kind of immune dysregulation, that these latent viruses are known to be sort of suppressed and forced into latency because of the immune pressure, right? So the fact that they're reactivating to me indicates that some sort of immune pressure being lifted in these people. And that may be what's kind of causing these reactivations.
So it could be that the reactivation itself, or the impacts of the reactivation of those viruses, could be causing things, or it could be whatever's causing the reactivation of those viruses, and the reactivation itself is just sort of a bystander effect. Is that possible too?
Absolutely. So we don't know which of these possibilities are true right now. And so we're trying to develop animal models to study, like, is it the cause of the symptom, or is it just the bystander of having dysregulated immune responses?
Okay, so that's the third. That's the third.
That's the third one. Yeah. So the last one is really kind of sort of dysregulation of tissue function by the inflammation. And we say this because we did this really cool experiment with Michel Monge's group at Stanford, where we tested the impact of very mild respiratory SARS-CoV-2 infection in mice. And in this system, only lung cells can be infected and no other tissues. And even with that, we're seeing significant impact in the brain. So 7 weeks after this very mild infection, the mice have significant damages in different regions of the brain that may be leading to neurocognitive deficits in these animals. So
even though there was no infection in the brain, the infection itself was limited to the respiratory tract or the lungs,
Exactly.
The sequelae were noticed elsewhere.
Absolutely. So that's the key here is that we're really confining the infection to one organ, which is the lung. And yet we're seeing significant impact in the brain, and we don't find the virus in the brain. So what this means is that inflammation that's happening in the lung is able to transmit, because lots of cytokines are circulating, transmit some inflammatory signal to the brain and causing this permanent damage or permanent changes in their function.
Mm-hmm.
So that's sort of the fourth hypothesis. And again, we have this animal model where we can probe different therapies and different alterations to see what's really causing this kind of impact.
So a couple of things. I know one you and had found low cortisol levels as one possible predictor, and also there's the microclots sort of theory. So where do those two things fit into this structure of different possible pathogenesis causes of pathogenesis?
Yeah, really great question. So these four hypotheses are the root cause hypotheses. So they're the ones that are like at the root of the problem. But downstream or of that root, or upstream, I guess, in the tree, you can certainly have other sort of consequences or pathologies that follow. So microclots and other coagulation issues may be downstream of, say, inflammation plus autoimmunity or persistent virus and innate immune activation. And also this low cortisol. So we're seeing sort of evidence for dysregulated hypothalamus pituitary organ axis, and cortisol level is one of them, but we're also seeing reduced testosterone levels in female patients with long COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And that reduced level of testosterone is really one of the biggest predictor of their symptomatology. So I think, again, like this sort of hormonal and endocrinology, the regulation of these different hormones that are regulated by the central nervous system may be impacted in patients with long COVID. And if we can somehow restore that, we may be able to restore a lot of the functionalities.
So basically, I think one of the points is that these four things, these four areas are certainly not mutually exclusive by any stretch. I mean, they all could be interacting, or
Absolutely.
some long COVID patients could be impacted by two of them, but not by the others.
Yeah. Absolutely. So they're not mutually exclusive. In some patients, as you say, they may have A and B and C and D's and others. While it's also possible that A triggers B and B triggers C and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So it may be a temporal relationship within the same person. But whatever it is, we need to understand which one of these things are being triggered in an individual, because the kinds of treatment that you would offer to people with autoimmunity is very different from those who are having persistent infection.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So one of the things that you and Dr. Petrino wrote in the paper that you had in, I guess it was April, um,
Yes.
was it is neither productive nor clinically or scientifically valid to classify long COVID as a psychosomatic condition. So I'm just curious why. I mean, I've seen there's been several high-profile articles. I mean, you were mentioned in one in the Slate, and then there was New Republic had one, a New York Magazine had one, all about long COVID as sort of a psychosocial strain or being caused by anxiety and depression, or as a functional neurological disorder, and so on. And so was that the context in which you and Dr. Petrino included that sentence, or what, you want to put that in context for me?
Sure. I mean, we definitely stand by that sentence. We were, I think, feeling frustrated about the sort of multiple publications that you mentioned, that it's kind of painting long COVID in a psychosomatic color,
Right.
and what that does, and I don't need to tell you that because you're the expert in this, but what that does is that it sort of limits the physician and the healthcare sort of decision of how to diagnose and treat these people. And if they are indeed in need of some kind of immunosuppressants to reduce the autoimmune diseases that's triggering the disease, if you're being labeled as psychosomatic, doctors are not going to think about treating you in this way, but perhaps, give you some kind of other therapies that will sort of treat something that's not triggering the disease. And we felt that it was harmful to paint this class of diseases as being psychosomatically driven. And of course, people are feeling a lot of, anxiety and depression as a result of having to deal with years of disability from from the long COVID. But to say that it's caused by anxiety or depression or other psychiatric conditions, it's just simply not true.
I think often though the term functional gets used as opposed to psychosomatic, or I think they've tried to. There's been an effort to, or a sense that psychosomatic is somehow is pejorative, and functional is the term often used to sort of, I think, be less pejorative or to suggest. I'm not sure exactly what is suggesting, but I've probably seen that as well.
Yeah, exactly. But it really doesn't matter how you label these things. You're just sort of sugarcoating, the diagnosis, which is not helpful.
So another thing that you all wrote, which also I think relates to the previous MECFS experience, which is finally the current knowledge surrounding long COVID would not be possible without the hard work and dedication of patient-led communities striving for answers. So I'm wondering, again, in the MECFS world, or in the when it was really more called CFS, and especially when the PACE trial came out and patients complained about some of the poor quality of the research, they were labeled by journal editors by the as dangerous to science, and there were some claims of harassment and sort of certain activities that patients supposedly got engaged in. And so there was a lot of antipathy between the researchers conducting these research and many of the patient organizations and communities. So you're basically saying that you've had a different experience, or that's not been your experience.
That's absolutely right. We're trying to overturn this kind of paradigm of, patient versus researchers or doctors. I mean, it shouldn't be that way at all. We're here to understand the disease collectively. So, and of course, patients are the experts of their own diseases, and the way in which they describe the diseases are incredibly informative in our research. And so we are trying to be, partners as opposed to, one studying the other. And that's been incredibly fruitful. I mean, I learn from patients every day about what has helped them and whether that we can put that in the context of science.
And so I think one of the arguments about, from the perspective of those who are proposing that these are psychosomatic, or these are functional, or these are driven by anxiety and depression, is that if you say no, they're not, or you say that there's actually pathogenesis, or pathological dysfunctions, even though they're not proven, that they'll say, well, it's that's mind-body dualism. You've probably heard that expressed, or that you're basically denigrating mental health, or you're denigrating people with mental illness, as if you're saying that mental illness has no impact. But that's not what anybody's saying. But do you get that? I mean, do you hear that from critics yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, obviously that is not at all our intention, is to denigrate mental health diseases at all. What we're saying is that long COVID, at least what we're able to already obtain data from patients, is that we can explain 94% with accuracy, 94% accuracy, long COVID, just by looking at the immunological factors alone. So to me, that says that this disease is driven by, something, or immune response to the infection or something else that's triggered by the infection. And we don't need to invoke other hypotheses to explain it. And that's what I mean. If the functional whatever hypothesis is true, I'd be happy to see the evidence of whether their parameters can explain with accuracy long COVID, and whether that is going to lead to some kind of a therapy. But that's not what we're seeing. I think, looking at the biology, and if we can't explain anything looking at the biology, that's one thing to sort of invoke other kinds of explanations.
Mhm.
but we don't need to.
And I think one of the issues here is that often the standard tests simply do not show the kinds of dysfunctions that you're talking about. So people go to the doctor, they get a standard panel of tests. The doctor says, "Hey, nothing wrong," and so on. Is that part of the idea that the tests need to be more sensitive, I guess, or more sensitive and specific, or more accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the standard routine lab tests are not going to pick up the differences that we're seeing. We had to test thousands of factors to find distinct features associated with long COVID.
Mhm.
So ultimately, what we want to do is to develop diagnostic biomarker that doctors can indeed order from their office to see whether someone has long COVID, and if so, what kind of long COVID they might have. Is it autoimmune driven? Is it persistent virus? Is it something else? We're not there yet, but that's where we want to be.
Mhm.
And yeah, just because a routine test doesn't show any changes, it doesn't mean that it's not there.
Right. That's a good point. I think that's often sort of been the presumption, though. If we can't find something in the standard test, that means that it's there isn't anything going wrong. Um, do you find that I guess what do you see as the prospects for? Well, actually, one of the things we're talking about is that long COVID, just to be clear, is not one thing. It's many different things. So,
Right.
what are the complications in trying to find? I mean, basically, how do you even segment the study population enough so that everything isn't crossing each other out, since they're not all suffering from the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what I should have said first, is that long COVID is not one disease, and it's multiple diseases under one umbrella. And that's why we're really focusing on the root causes, because we can treat the root causes, right? Um, in any case, yes, I agree that it's very difficult to dissociate them, but one path to dissociating these subtypes of long COVID is through clinical trials coupled with biological analyses.
Hmm.
So we have a Paxlovid trial ongoing at Yale. It's actually a decentralized trial, so anyone in the states that are approved can enroll in this study. But essentially, the primary outcome is to really look at the effectiveness of 15-day course of Paxlovid in seeing whether people, feel better or symptoms improve.
Hmm.
But the other sort of external or things that we're doing with that is to understand, measure immunological factors before and after the treatment,
Hmm.
and to see what markers are correlating with their positive response.
I see.
And if we can identify those biomarkers, not only does that give us a tool to screen for people with those markers for further treatment, but also gives us a kind of a marker for persistent virus infection.
Hmm.
Because Paxlovid is a very targeted drug that's against the virus itself. And that way we can sort of actually find a biomarker at the same time for persistent infection, right? So if we can do this for autoimmunity and for inflammation and for a reactive, latent viruses, all sort of throughout the world, uh, imagine how much we can learn from these kinds of trials, right?
So I guess then that leads me to probably my last question, because you have to go in a minute. What are the prospects for treatments at this point? Because I think patients are obviously research is interesting, but patients, after all, really want treatments that are going to help them. So where do you see that, and do you have any kind of timelines or predictions?
Yeah, so the treatment, we're still early phase, and usually disease research takes, years to decades to understand the underlying causes, right? But we can accelerate it, like I said, with the concomitant clinical trial that's coupled with biological analyses. And I feel that because of efforts that are ongoing throughout the world, we will be able to get there much faster than if we had just sort of, without other kinds of diseases.
Hmm.
And so I am hopeful that we will be able to find biomarkers for subsets of long COVID, as well as come up with a proper treatment that will help people with long COVID.
And do you think, how will that reflect on treatments and on the care for people with ME/CFS at this point, and perhaps other post-acute infection syndromes?
Yeah, a really great question. I mean, we with this center, what we're trying to do is to compare head to head the biomarkers that we see from people with long COVID versus those who have ME/CFS versus who have chronic Lyme, for example, to be able to understand what are the overlapping similarities and differences. And that way we can say, okay, with long COVID, X, Y, and Z treatments work with these types of markers, right? Can we translate that to treatment of ME/CFS? And of course, ME/CFS, it's a little bit more complicated because the triggering agents may not be known to the patients.
Right. I mean,
But yeah, but if we can find a biomarker for autoimmunity, for example, we might be able to apply the same marker for people with ME to be able to treat, at least do clinical trials with those drugs to see if they improve. So I think there's a lot of crosstalk between these diseases, and
mhm.
that's why we're very excited to do this at the scale of the center.
Okay, listen, thanks very much.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate your time, and uh, I'll be in touch.
Thank you so much, David.
Okay, thanks, Kiko. Bye.
Bye bye.